faithfully delivering value by interpreting the world's best books. Hello, this is Sally Book Talks. Today, we're interpreting the book Post-War Europe History Volume 1, The End of Old Europe, covering 1945 to 1953, authored by the renowned British historian Tony Judt. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally, ending the fighting in the European theater of World War II. For Europeans, this great slaughter that lasted nearly 6 years and caused tens of millions of deaths had finally come to an end. Naturally, the victorious Allied nations were jubilant, while the defeated Axis populations breathed a sigh of relief because they no longer had to worry about being sent to the battlefield as fascist cannon fodder. The nightmare days were finally over, and everyone hoped Europe would quickly recover and return to that prosperous, stable, and hopeful golden age. It took many years before people realized War I-II was like a chasm, dividing Europe's modern history into two sections, pre-war and post-war Europe. Pre-war Europe was definitely gone forever. Post-war Europe was then split into eastern and western parts due to the US-Soviet rivalry. This profoundly changed Europe's political and economic landscape, social fabric, and ideologies, with effects lasting to this day. It could even be said that until now, Europe is still shrouded in the post-war atmosphere. For example, NATO, Europe's most important military cooperation organization, was founded in 1949, shortly after the war ended. From this perspective, understanding today's Europe should start from the post-war era. For this reason, Tony Judt, a contemporary British historian and the most renowned European affairs scholar, spent over a decade to produce this monumental 4-volume work. It's Post-War Europe History. With his fluent and profound writing, panoramically outlines post-war Europe's complex aspects in politics, economy, society, culture, and more.
As soon as it was published in 2005, this book was hailed as the best work on post-war European history.
Today, I'll talk about the first volume, The End of Old Europe. The narrative covering 1945 to 1953 is divided into 4 parts. Part 1, The Miserable and Desolate Post-War Europe. Part 2, From Settling Accounts with Fascism to Deliberate Forgetting. Part 3, The Difficult and Winding Road to Reconstruction. Part 4, Europe torn apart by the Cold War! All right, now let's talk about Part 1, The Miserable and Desolate Post-War Europe. From September 1939, when German forces blitzed Poland, to May 1945, when Soviet troops captured Berlin, nearly 6 years of war dealt a devastating blow to all of Europe. So much so that the author describes post-war Europe with the words miserable and desolate. This is mainly reflected in 3 aspects. First, massive civilian casualties led to a sharp population decline. Statistics show 36.5 million Europeans died from war-related causes during World War II, equivalent to France's entire pre-war population. Civilians accounted for over half of these deaths. Western Europe fared better. In Britain and Germany, military deaths far outnumbered civilians, while Eastern Europe suffered extreme devastation. The hardest hit USSR saw 16 million civilian deaths, twice its military losses. Poland had 5 million civilian deaths, Yugoslavia 1.4 million, resulting in severe gender imbalance. By war's end, Soviet women outnumbered men by 20 million. Gender ratios took decades to normalize. Yugoslavia fared worse. Nazis executed all males over 15 to suppress partisans, leaving many areas without adult men post-war. It can be said that no war in recorded history killed so many in such short time. Population collapse turned once bustling towns into deserted ghost towns. Now, the second aspect, widespread destruction of towns and villages plunged people into hardship. During World War II, excepting cities like Rome, Prague, and Paris, most towns and villages endured war's ravages. In 1940 alone, Germans flattened Rotterdam, Netherlands' largest port, and Coventry, UK industrial hub. Germany's invasions of Poland, Yugoslavia, and USSR erased numerous mid-sized cities from the map. In the USSR alone, approximately 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages were destroyed. Famed cities like Kyiv, Minsk, and Leningrad lay in ruins. After the tide turned, Allies bombarded Nazi Germany. Dozens of cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were obliterated. When the Red Army stormed Berlin, 40,000 tons of artillery shells destroyed 75% of buildings. After the war, Berlin residents struggled to find shelter. With housing and infrastructure destroyed by war, plus massive resource depletion, European nations faced severe difficulties in healthcare, food supply, and public safety management. In July 1945, damaged water systems contaminated drinking water in Berlin, causing dysentery outbreaks where newborn mortality soared to a shocking 66%, while Vienna's infant mortality reached 4 times pre-war levels. In Warsaw, nearly 20% contracted tuberculosis due to poor conditions, and hunger was rampant. The war cost Eastern European countries millions of dairy cows. Milk production plummeted, causing malnutrition in children deprived of milk. The weakest even died. Many countries implemented food rationing, but rations were severely inadequate. Starvation deaths occurred in the Netherlands, Germany, and Poland, but Jewish people suffered most tragically. Of survivors rescued by allies from Nazi camps, 4 in 10 died due to lacking nutrition and medical care. Post-war Europe's misery also manifested in a third aspect: mass population migrations. During the war, Nazi Germany captured 5.5 million Soviet soldiers. About 2.2 million survived, while the USSR captured 3.5 million Axis soldiers. Additionally, Nazis conscripted over 7.48 million forced laborers from occupied territories for war production. All needed repatriation. Repatriating POWs and laborers proceeded orderly without causing social upheaval. But retaliatory actions painted a different picture. In 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland under the pretext of its German majority population. After surrender, Czechoslovak President Edvard Beneš decreed to solve the German problem permanently by stripping 3 million Sudeten Germans of citizenship, confiscating their property, and expelling them. This wasn't isolated. Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Romania also expelled ethnic Germans. Even those settled for generations who barely spoke German were expelled. Such was the irrationality of ethnically driven revenge. Another migration wave resulted from shifting national borders. Poland serves as a typical example. In 1939, Stalin and Hitler secretly agreed to partition Poland. After war broke out, Nazi Germany occupied Western Poland, while the Soviet Union took the East. This eastern territory was temporarily lost during the Soviet-German War, but as Soviet forces counterattacked, they reclaimed it. After the war, Stalin annexed these lands to Ukraine as compensation. He took territory from Germany and gave it to Poland, effectively exchanging Poland's 180,000 square kilometers eastern lands for over 100,000 square kilometers of German territory. Though smaller in area, the new land was more fertile, balancing things out. The question remained what to do with the 7 million Germans living on this new land. The Polish government's solution: expel them all. Thus, millions of Germans were brutally expelled, with many killed by resentful Poles during the journey. This scene shocked Western journalists who witnessed it. Anne McCormick of the New York Times wrote that the violence during expulsions was unprecedented. Well, statistics show 13 million ethnic Germans scattered across Europe were expelled to Germany after the war. And in hindsight, this influx actually eased labor shortages, though that's another story. For Germany at the time, this worsened housing and food crises. To address this, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration undertook massive relief efforts. From June 1945 to June 1947, Britain, Canada, and the U.S. provided $10 billion to support UNRWA's measures. The agency established 762 camps and relief centers across Germany, Poland, France, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, etc., aiding over 15 million refugees. For instance, UNRWA supplied 60% of Poland's and 80% of Czechoslovakia's food consumption, crucial for surviving early post-war hardships. While restoring supplies and basic sustenance, European nations faced another major war legacy: how to handle fascism. Part 2, From Settling Accounts with Fascism to Deliberate Forgetting, addresses this issue. Nazi Germany's WA2 atrocities: forced labor, torture of POWs and civilians, genocide, shocked a generation. After the war, European nations agreed they must purge these atrocities and their ideological roots through denazification to prevent history repeating. The Nuremberg International Military Tribunal tried top Nazis, 18 leaders convicted, 11 executed, while SS and Gestapo were declared criminal organizations. Later Nuremberg trials convicted tens of thousands of high-level Nazis. Former Axis states like Italy, Hungary, and occupied nations like France, Netherlands also tried collaborators. Courts sprang up everywhere in post-war Europe. Fascists seemingly had nowhere to hide, but as trials deepened, governments hit a thorny problem that led to abruptly ending the fascist purge. The issue: strictly defining fascists would implicate too many people. Full removal would hinder reconstruction and cause social chaos. Germany's Nuremberg trials typically punished major war criminals. But post-war Germany had 8 million Nazi Party members, including scarce professionals like doctors, engineers, and city managers. In Bonn, 102 of 112 doctors were Nazi members. At Cologne Water Authority, 18 out of 21 experts were Nazis. Their skills in restoring water systems and preventing disease made prosecution unwise. Moreover, purging ordinary Germans would collapse the nation. Thus, statesman Konrad Adenauer urged distinguishing true Nazis from fellow travelers, those who complied under duress without committing evil, who deserved leniency. Adenauer, who resisted Nazis, loathed fascism but took a practical view. Its deep roots in Germany meant denazification must be gradual. Forcing it would breed German defiance, not remorse. Just like post-WN. Wasn't post.WN Germany exactly like this? Adenauer voiced Germans' belief they were Nazi victims too, enduring food, healthcare, housing shortages. That was punishment enough. This German attitude made the Allies realize denazification couldn't be rushed. So in the Allied occupation zones of Germany, West Germany, they had citizens complete questionnaires about wartime conduct. The Allies identified 3.5 million as potentially prosecutable, but since they were just potential, most faced no charges. They bypassed full reckoning by documenting but not pursuing cases. By 1949, West Germany's civil servant investigations ended. Ex-Nazis returned to government, resulting in 43% of diplomats being former stormtroopers and 17% ex-Gestapo, ex-Marina, Black Gestapo. A 1950 West German poll showed 1/3 saw Nuremberg trials as victor's revenge, unfair. West Germany's genuine reckoning with fascism wouldn't come for over a decade. As for Nazi Germany's chief accomplice, Austria escaped reckoning by recasting itself as a Nazi victim. Pre-WWE, Austrians jubilantly welcomed the Anschluss, merging with Germany. Austria rapidly Nazified. By war's outbreak, 700,000 of 7 million Austrians were Nazi Party members. By war's end, over 530,000 fascists remained, with shocking infiltration of Austria's cultural elite. For example, 45 of Vienna Philharmonic's 117 members were Nazis, far exceeding Berlin Philharmonic's ratio. During the war, 1.2 million Austrians served the Nazis, many joining the SS to implement the genocide against Jews. Austrian fascists literally had Jewish blood on their hands. Yet post-war Austria, after executing 30 worst offenders and stripping Nazis' voting rights, considered the matter closed. In 1947, Austria categorized fascists by severity, pardoning approximately 500,000 low-level Nazis in 1948, voting rights restored, and amnesting all high-level by 1956. This was blatant whitewashing. To cover up, Austrians reframed the Anschluss as Germany's first annexation of another nation. Austria was the Nazis' first victim, and Austrians joined the Nazi Party under coercion. Thus, Austrians deliberately erased their collaboration with Nazis and their complicity in Nazi crimes. If even defeated nations like Germany and Austria acted this way, Nazi-occupied territories had even less motivation to purge fascists. And take France. Nazis ruled indirectly through the puppet Vichy regime for repression, administration, and economic exploitation. Of 35 million French, few joined the resistance or Free France abroad. Most stayed passive, allowing Nazi control with just 6,000 police. If strictly judged, wouldn't that make nearly every French person a collaborator? More ironically, over half the post-war trial judges came from the Vichy regime itself. Ultimately, French courts sentenced 6,763 to death, but executed only 791, with about 350,000 when collaborators received reduced civil rights, barred from law, education, media, finance positions, but soon had rights restored. France's fascist reckoning thus ended with symbolic gestures but minimal consequences. After all, responsibility belonged only to Nazis and explicit collaborators. Ordinary French bore none. The French preferred casting themselves as patriots, secretly supporting de Gaulle's Free France. The Vichy era became a gray memory, forever unmentioned. By contrast, Eastern Europe pursued denazification far more thoroughly. This stemmed from Nazi brutality there. In Poland, Nazis plundered extensively and conscripted 2.8 million Poles as forced laborers during the war. Later, the Warsaw Uprising was brutally crushed, reducing the city to ruins. This fueled Polish retaliatory justice. They spontaneously executed fascists after Germany's surrender. Czechoslovakia followed suit. Czechoslovakia's special people's courts sentenced 713 to death, 741 to life imprisonment, and nearly 20,000 to prison terms. And is it why? Another crucial external factor enabled Eastern Europe's harsh stance against fascists. From September 1939, when German forces blitzed Poland, to May 1945, when Soviet troops captured Berlin, nearly 6 years of war dealt a devastating blow to all of Europe. So much so that the author describes post-war Europe with the words miserable and desolate. This is mainly reflected in three aspects. First, massive civilian casualties led to a sharp population decline. Statistics show 36.5 million Europeans died from war-related causes during World War II, equivalent to France's entire pre-war population. Civilians accounted for over half of these deaths. Western Europe fared better. In Britain and Germany, military deaths far outnumbered civilians, while Eastern Europe suffered extreme devastation. The hardest-hit USSR saw 16 million civilian deaths, twice its military losses. Poland had 5 million civilian deaths, Yugoslavia 1.4 million, resulting in severe gender imbalance. By war's end, Soviet women outnumbered men by 20 million. Gender ratios took decades to normalize.
Yugoslavia fared worse. Nazis executed all males over 15 to suppress partisans, leaving many areas without adult men post-war.
It can be said that no war in recorded history killed so many in such short time. Population collapse turned once bustling towns into deserted ghost towns. Now the second aspect. Widespread destruction of towns and villages plunged people into hardship. During World War II, excepting cities like Rome, Prague, and Paris, most towns and villages endured war's ravages. In 1940 alone, Germans flattened Rotterdam, Netherlands' largest port, and Coventry, UK industrial hub. Germany's invasions of Poland, Yugoslavia, and USSR erased numerous mid-sized cities from the map. In the USSR alone, approximately 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages were destroyed. Famed cities like Kyiv, Minsk, and Leningrad lay in ruins. After the tide turned, Allies bombarded Nazi Germany. Dozens of cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were obliterated. When the Red Army stormed Berlin, 40,000 tons of artillery shells, destroyed 75% of buildings. So in part 3, I'll discuss Europe's difficult and winding reconstruction journey. And in March 1946, former British Prime Minister Churchill delivered a speech claiming the Soviet Union was drawing an iron curtain between Western and Eastern Europe. Stalin immediately condemned Churchill's remarks. Comparing Churchill to Hitler, Stalin declared the Soviet Union would never yield. People typically regard this exchange as the Cold War's starting point. However, the author notes this interpretation emerged retrospectively after the Cold War began. This retrospective framing doesn't match reality. In actuality, Americans reacted coolly to Churchill's speech. The Wall Street Journal criticized Churchill, while Vice President Wallace stated, "The British Empire has as little in common with us as the Soviet Union," clearly undermining him. Now, ultimately, mere rhetoric couldn't ignite the Cold War.
Churchill's accusation of Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe was disingenuous.
Late in the war, he'd secretly made the percentages agreement with Stalin, granting the USSR 90% influence in Romania post-war, 75% in Bulgaria. In exchange, Britain got 90% in Greece, with Yugoslavia and Hungary split 50-50. Stalin later honored this agreement. In Soviet-dominated Romania and Bulgaria, Stalin established socialist regimes. In Hungary, 50% Soviet and non-agreement nations Poland, Czechoslovakia, he brokered communist-led coalition governments. When Greek communists were defeated by government forces, Stalin offered no help. Per the agreement, Greece was Britain's sphere. Stalin further restrained himself by limiting radical reforms, land confiscation or collectivization, to Romania. Stalin appeared unwilling to impose Soviet systems on Europe, reassuring capitalist Western nations, even seeming dependable. At this stage, Western Europe feared German resurgence more than Soviet control of Eastern Europe. They had expected America to suppress Germany. But America drastically downsized its military post-war, with European troop numbers plummeting. Plus, Americans weren't enthusiastic about European affairs then. In this situation, the Soviet Union wasn't a threat, but rather a crucial force for containing Germany and maintaining post-war order. And forget about the Cold War for now. This pragmatic attitude let Europeans focus on reconstruction, and Europe gradually recovered. In Western Europe, Belgium suffered the lightest war damage and thus recovered fastest. France, Norway, the Netherlands, and Italy were also dredging canals, repairing roads, and rebuilding factories and farms. By late 1946, most railways and road networks in Western Europe had been restored. In Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia was already an industrial powerhouse pre-war, and Germany strengthened its military industry during the war. This became its recovery foundation. Poland suffered the worst damage, but it gained vast Eastern German territories, including the industrial Silesia region, greatly aiding reconstruction. By 1947, major Eastern European cities had regained vitality. Transport networks and rolling stock exceeded pre-war levels, with living standards improving. Well, I spoke here Western Europe learned from past lessons. What lessons? After WWN, Western Europe clung to laissez-faire policies. No worker protections, no aid for vulnerable groups, no wealth gap reduction, just hoping society would self-heal and prosper. The result? In 1929, New York's stock market crashed, unleashing a global financial storm. Unemployment soared, prices skyrocketed, shortages spread, and governments did nothing. People in despair began craving a powerful savior. This gave fascism its opening. Hence, post-war Western Europe agreed. The tougher times get, the more social security is needed to uproot fascism's breeding ground. Here, Britain led the way. Back in 1942, British sociologist William Beveridge published a report urging welfare policies, ensuring full employment while guaranteeing 3 protections per citizen: a national health service, adequate state pensions, and family allowances. Post-war labor came to power and built a welfare system modeled on Beveridge's report, prompting other Western European nations to follow. One more finds the welfare work, and despite post-war economies limiting welfare provisions, they at least ensured basic sustenance and prevented social unrest. By late 1946, Europe was recovering. Unexpectedly, the situation abruptly deteriorated, though warning signs had appeared. In autumn 1946, drought caused crop failures in Ukraine, Europe's breadbasket, triggering inevitable continental repercussions. Worse, the following year brought Europe's harshest winter in 60 years. Canals froze, blizzards paralyzed railways and roads for weeks. Factories halted, coal shortages left people freezing. Then spring floods submerged vast areas. By June 1947, the continent endured its hottest, driest summer on record. Ukraine, already reeling from poor harvests, plunged into famine. Other European farm regions suffered equally, leaving millions starving. This delivered a crushing blow to Europe's fragile economic recovery. Steel production, economic barometer, plummeted 40%, fueling inflation across nations. Hungary's hyperinflation peaked at 100,000 local currency units per US dollar. This exceeded Weimar Germany's crisis. Western Europe's new welfare systems prevented starvation but strained treasuries. With economies declining, finances grew precarious. Britain quadrupled national debt issuance by 1947, soon unable to even pay interest. Europeans felt prosperity's brief glimpse was vanishing. A French poll showed 92% deemed conditions disastrous. French Economic Minister André Philippe warned, "We face economic and financial catastrophe." British Labour Minister Dalton lamented, "Mornings of confidence won't return." This crisis caught American attention. They observed Europe teetering on collapse, an ominous sign. Historical patterns showed severe capitalist crises pushed people toward communism. Data confirmed this trend. 1947 marked explosive growth for European communist parties. Italy's reached 2.25 million members. France's exceeded 900,000. West Germany lacked a communist party, but Soviet sympathy grew even in Denmark and Norway. 1 in 8 voters leaned communist. Calls to learn from the Soviets to solve the crisis grew louder daily. This trajectory risked communist governments in Western Europe, meaning further Soviet expansion unacceptable to America. Thus, Europe's rescue became imperative. But how? Previous U.S. loans, $0 billion, were deemed insufficient by Secretary Marshall. Mere disaster relief, not crisis solutions. Marshall proposed strategic aid, ample funding, broad coverage, long duration. Targeted at industry, commerce, and finance to rebuild Europe, the Marshall Plan was born. In July 1947, the U.S. finalized agreements with 16 European nations, launching the plan. Earlier U.S. overtures to Eastern Europe were rejected. Stalin feared aid would pull Eastern Europe toward America, making the Marshall Plan Europe's great divider. Western Europe recovered faster. 30% GDP growth 1947 to 1951 with improved production. The dividing line solidified. Eastern Europe's recovery lagged. Economic models diverged. West avoided communism, East embraced it openly. In Czechoslovakia, the state seized all large enterprises, industry, commerce, finance, nationalized. By February 1948, most industrial workers became state employees. A planned economy took shape. That month, communists expelled right-wing parties from government, the Prague coup. The author points out that this means Stalin believed there were irreconcilable contradictions between the Soviet Union and the West, so there was no need to preserve the coalition government. Instead, left-wing parties should take power. Oh, the Cold War is really coming. In Part 4, Europe torn apart by the Cold War, I'll discuss the impact of the Cold War on Europe. The Prague coup triggered a chain reaction. First, France's attitude shifted. Originally, France's strategy was to court the Soviet Union to contain Germany. For this, France was willing to let the Soviet Union maintain influence in Eastern Europe. The condition was allowing bourgeois parties to exist, to maintain political balance, manifested as a coalition government. The Prague coup overturned the coalition government, sounding the alarm for France. Clearly, the Soviet Union was no longer a reliable ally, but a real threat, and France had to consider resisting it, which couldn't be done without Germany. Because since the late 19th century, Germany has been Europe's largest economy. Without this, Western Europe lacked the strength to counter the Soviet Union, leaving France in a dilemma. Germany's revival might not stop the Soviets, but if not prevented, how to stop its old aggressive tendencies? The French solution was to reduce military strength and boost economic value, helping Germany recover economically while prohibiting its rearmament. In March 1948, France, Britain, Belgium, and others signed the Brussels Treaty. The next year, they brought in America to form NATO, collectively guarding against Germany. This was reducing military strength. In June 1948, the US, UK, and France met in London and decided to establish a state in the Allied occupation zones of Germany. West Germany. West Germany joined the Marshall Plan and received American aid. This was boosting economic value. Only then did France feel its national security was guaranteed. But Stalin interpreted these actions as the West planning to reuse Germany against the Soviet Union. Stalin reacted swiftly, announcing the establishment of East Germany in the Soviet zone while imposing a blockade on Berlin. At that time, the US, UK, and France only occupied West Berlin, surrounded by the Soviet zone. So West Berlin was like an enclave of West Germany. The Soviet Union tried to force the Allies out of Berlin through the blockade, but they immediately organized an airlift, continuously supplying West Berlin to keep it functioning. In May 1949, the Soviet Union announced the lifting of the blockade, effectively admitting defeat. The Berlin crisis ended, and Germany was thus split into two nations, West Germany and East Germany, but they hadn't yet completely broken off relations. The final domino fell in June 1950 when the Korean War erupted. The West believed Soviet backing was behind it, with East Germany attacking West Germany as the next phase. In hindsight, this assessment was utterly wrong, yet history often sees flawed judgments leading to flawed decisions that reshape reality. NATO began treating the USSR as its primary adversary. U.S. military spending skyrocketed from $15.05 to $70 billion. Britain and France also drastically increased military expenditures. World War II Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower returned to Europe as NATO's military chief. This intensified Stalin's suspicions in turn. He became convinced NATO would attack Eastern Europe. Rumors of World War III proliferated. At this point, Europe split completely. The Soviet Eastern Bloc on one side, NATO-led Western nations on the other. The Cold War officially began. With the rupture complete, Stalin shed all restraint. He would reshape Eastern Europe by his blueprint, securing Soviet political and economic control to confront the West. First, politics. By early 1950s, leftist parties dominated all 5 Eastern European states. Other parties dissolved or absorbed, ending coalition governments. Simultaneously, Stalin purged these nations' leftist parties to ensure obedience to Moscow. The Slansky trial epitomized this. As Czechoslovakia's second highest communist, crucial to the Prague coup, his crime was advocating socialism suited to Czechoslovakia's conditions. In September 1950, Slansky was arrested. 2 years later, a Soviet-controlled court convicted him as a Western spy and executed him. Around Slansky's trial, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria underwent similar party purges. As for East Germany, SED chairman Wilhelm Pieck, having lived 12 years in the USSR with Stalin's trust, secured Soviet political control. Economically, the USSR established the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMCON, incorporating Eastern Europe and East Germany. Each COMCON member had to conduct bilateral trade with the USSR, seemingly mutual benefit. But what did this entail? How are trade prices determined? The Soviet Union decides. For example, Poland and Romania produced food and primary industrial goods, while East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary handled finished industrial products. Divisions so detailed, some countries exclusively supplied shoes, others trucks. The USSR assigned roles to Eastern European nations based on its own needs, leveraging strengths and covering weaknesses. It ignored Eastern Europe's natural resources or suitable industries, reducing them to Soviet satellites constantly exploited. Statistics show the U.S. injected approximately $14 billion into Western Europe via the Marshall Plan. Conversely, Stalin extracted similar sums from Eastern Europe through Comcon. This inevitably bred resentment. Initially, Eastern Europeans saw the USSR as liberators, hoping for protection against invasion. When the USSR pushed social reforms, people welcomed them. Weak industrial bases made Soviet-style heavy industry investment and land reforms appealing. Rapid industrialization, urbanization created worker opportunities that citizens embraced. Polish poet Czesław Miłosz's words capture this sentiment. "I'm glad Poland's semi-feudal society was destroyed. Universities opened to young workers and peasants. Agrarian reforms progressed. Industrialization finally began." But post-Cold War, Soviet policies shifted to political control and economic exploitation. Disillusionment spread, driving intellectuals like Milosz and Hungarian historian Ferenc Vieto to flee to France. Milosz's 1951 book, The Captive Mind, criticized Soviet oppression through personal experience. How should this book be judged? French intellectuals split. Sartre, Beauvoir, and Merleau-Ponty still favored the USSR while distrusting America. They saw The Captive Mind as American imperialist propaganda. Attacking the USSR, they claimed, justified American cultural invasion, but Camus differed. Though initially pro-Soviet like Sartre, Eastern Europe's political purges showed Camus' reality's brutality. The Captive Mind exposed this truth. French liberal thinker Raymond Aron and German philosopher Karl Jasper also defended Milosz. Thus, a rift emerged in European cultural circles. Sartre and Beauvoir supporting Soviet ideology on one side, Camus and Raymond Aron criticizing it on the other. We now know this debate was partly a product of U.S.-Soviet rivalry. After the Korean War erupted, the CIA funded anti-Soviet rhetoric through various channels. By 1953, CIA-backed U.S. cultural programs employed 13,000 people at $129 million cost, targeting Western European intellectuals with anti-Soviet propaganda. Of course, the Soviet Union was no pushover either. It used leftist parties and pro-communist intellectuals to attack American imperialism and control Western Europe. This was essentially the Cold War's cultural front. Thus, Europe became fractured politically, economically, and culturally. Old Europe as a unified entity ceased to exist. By early 1953, this became consensus across European nations. Observers widely believed Europe faced post-war depression, deepening social divides, even WW3 sparked by US-Soviet confrontation, a bleak outlook. Unexpectedly, relations between Western nations and the Eastern Bloc rapidly thawed, granting Europe peace and stability. Western Europe's economy soared, living standards rose rapidly, and comprehensive welfare states emerged. Eastern Europe pursued economic reforms to restore vitality.
Meanwhile, rising younger generations brought new social challenges.
I'll cover these in Volume 2. Thus concludes Volume 1, The End of Old Europe. That's our interpretation of 1945 to 1953. Find reading notes below the audio. See you next time.